In 2020, during a global pandemic, you showed up from protests to the polls. Together, we showed the world our power.
But we're not done yet. Our democracy and our vote, the very foundation of this nation and the most powerful tools we have as citizens, are under attack.
Right now, dangerous legislation is being proposed across the country that limits the freedom to vote, cast our ballots, and have our votes counted.
Many of these proposals would disproportionately impact Black, brown, young, and working class voters, and voters with disabilities.
They're counting on us to stop paying attention. They're counting on us to be quiet.
But they must not know who we are. Our work is just beginning.
This fight isn't about who's president or who's in Congress.
It's about our families, our neighborhoods, our schools, and our communities.
It's about a country that belongs to all of us.
And it's about our freedom to vote and our ability to make our voices heard.
That's why Fair Fight Action and When We All Vote are working day and night to protect our freedom to vote.
We need you in this fight with us to build the country we all deserve. That's what our progress demands. So, what's our game plan?
We're calling on members of Congress every day to tell them to protect and strengthen our access to the ballot.
We're checking our voter registration status and ensuring everyone in our community is registered to vote.
And we're working to change the future of this nation. It's not going to be easy, but nothing this important ever is. We need you. Are you in?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Congressional Black Caucus Foundation virtual 2021 ALC Virtual Voting Rights Braintrust. My name is David Morgan, and I am president of the Multicultural Media and Correspondence Association, a BIPOC and nonpartisan nonprofit working to secure greater control over who, what, where, when, and how our story is told. Today, I have the distinct honor of introducing our honorary host, Congresswoman Terri Sewell. But first, I'd like to thank all of our board members and all the great organizations leading the important fight for voting rights. Congresswoman Terri Sewell represents Alabama's 7th District. She currently sits on the exclusive House Ways and Means Committee, served as Chief Deputy Whip, and sits on the prestigious Steering and Policy Committee, which sets the policy direction of the Democratic Caucus. Representative Sewell is one of the most vocal and influential champions on voting rights in the U.S. Congress. She is the sponsor of H.R. 4. She currently serves as co-chair of the Congressional Voting Rights Caucus and is co-chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Voting Rights Task Force. Also of note, Representative Sewell has the distinction of being the first Black woman to ever serve in the Alabama Congressional Delegation. She's a proud product of Alabama's rural Black Belt. She was the first Black valedictorian of Selma High School. She's an honors graduate of Princeton University and Oxford University in England, and a fellow alum, having received her law degree from Harvard Law School. I give you the Honorable Terri Sewell, Democrat, Alabama.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Terri Sewell, and I proudly represent Alabama's 7th Congressional District, the Civil Rights District, which includes the historic cities of Birmingham, Montgomery, Tuscaloosa, and my hometown of Selma, Alabama. I am thrilled to be here for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation 2021 Annual Legislative Conference to serve as chair of the Voting Rights Braintrust and to host this critical conversation about winning the fight for voting rights in America. For me, the fight for voting rights has always been personal. Growing up in Selma, Alabama, I didn't need to read about the voting rights movement in history books. The brave foot soldiers who marched, fought, and bled on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. For me, they were my neighbors, my church members, members of my community, and even my babysitter. Today, old battles have become new again as we witness the most coordinated effort to restrict the right to vote in generations. Since the 2013 Supreme Court decision in Shelby v. Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, states across the country have been ramping up their efforts to restrict access to the ballot box. Just this year, state legislatures have already introduced 400 bills to restrict the right to vote, and in 18 states, 30 of these bills have become law. The need for federal oversight has never been more urgent, which is why on August 17th, I proudly stood at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in my hometown of Selma, Alabama, to announce the introduction of H.R. 4, the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This bill, named for my dear friend and former colleague, will restore the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and prevent states with a recent history of voter discrimination from restricting the right to vote. Just 1 week later, on August 24th, H.R. 4 passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 219 to 212. Now the Senate must do everything in its power, using every tool at its disposal, to pass H.R. 4 and ensure that it is signed into law by President Joe Biden. Never did I think that the cause for which the foot soldiers marched 56 years ago would become our cause too. It goes to show you that progress is elusive, and every generation must fight and fight again to preserve the progress of the past and advance it. As the fight continues, I'm proud to be hosting this critical conversation on how we can win the fight for voting rights in America. Today's program will consist of 2 panels. The first will feature our nation's premier legal and policy experts to discuss the nuts and bolts of the current legal and legislative effort to strengthen voting rights at the federal and state levels. The second panel will bring together our nation's visionary leaders and influencers in the fight for voting rights to discuss what this assault on voting rights reveals about who we are as Americans. Our panelists will also discuss how corporate America, civil society, media, and social influencers can work together to galvanize support for reform, while not losing sight of the transformation we need to have in the long term. I'm so excited for you to hear these 2 panels, so let's take it away. Today, I am joined by our honorary co-hosts, 2 champions for the right to vote who have helped lead our effort in Congress to pass federal voting rights legislation. Congressman G.K. Butterfield is the chairman of the House Committee on Administration, Subcommittee on Elections, and the U.S. Representative for North Carolina's 1st Congressional District. Chairman Butterfield played an integral role in passing H.R. 4, holding a series of hearings on the state of voting rights in America, which culminated in a report that informed the bill's text.
On August 6, 1965, Congress passed on a bipartisan basis the historic, transformative Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act eliminated the literacy test. It created a Section 2 that enabled the African American community to litigate in federal court grievances regarding election practices and procedures, including redistricting. It created a Section 5 that requires the Department of Justice to review election changes in certain jurisdictions to determine whether they will have a discriminatory impact. The 1965 Voting Rights Act has worked quite well. Many of us in the Congressional Black Caucus can attribute our ability to fairly compete in our districts because the VRA required Southern states in particular to draw congressional districts to guarantee that the African American community could elect Congress members of their choice. But on June 25, 2013, in the Shelby County case, the Supreme Court ruled that Section 5 is necessary and constitutional, But the court ruled that the formula being used to determine which jurisdictions are covered is an out-of-date formula. And so, the House of Representatives last week passed an updated formula by a vote of 219 to 212. Congresswoman Terri Sewell led that legislation. We refer to it as H.R. 4, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Now we await Senate action. It is my hope that all 50 Democratic senators will support passage and that at least 10 Republican senators will do the same. If 60 votes is not achievable in the Senate, it is my fervent hope that the 50 senators will agree to modify Senate rules to allow a simple majority to pass this important legislation. If 51 votes can confirm a Supreme Court justice, then 51 votes should be sufficient to protect the right to vote. And so I want to thank all of our panelists today. I want to thank the former First Lady of the United States of America, our beloved Michelle Obama. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to my dear colleague and friend, Congresswoman Terri Sewell, for your leadership. Thank you for your incredible work on H.R. 4. I worked hand in hand with Congresswoman Sewell as I led the Committee on Elections, and we developed the legislative record to support passage of this important legislation. And to my other good friend over in the other body, Senator Raphael Warnock. Thank you, Senator Reverend Warnock, for your incredible work, your work at Ebenezer, your work in Atlanta to support passage of this important legislation. And to our first panel, LaTosha Brown, the co-founder of Black Voters Matter, John C. Yang, who is the president, executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and the other great friend that I have is Sherilyn Ifill, who leads that great organization called the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Thank you, Sherilyn. Thank you, John. Thank you, LaTosha, for joining us today. On the second panel, Panel 2 will bring together visionary leaders and influencers in the fight for voting rights. The participants for our second panel are names that all of you will certainly recognize. The legendary Stacey Abrams. Stacey is from, Atlanta, Georgia. She has been a dynamic force in electoral politics in the state of Georgia now for many years. Thank you, Stacey, for engaging in a fair fight. And that is the name of your organization. You are the founder of Fair Fight. And to Eric Holder. Eric is no stranger to anyone on this call. Eric Holder Jr. was the Attorney General of the United States under President Barack Obama. As I recall, General Holder was the very first cabinet appointment made by President Obama in his first administration. Eric Holder is now the chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, and he's watching with a very careful eye all of the work of state legislatures in changing election laws, and he is ready to challenge those laws if we see anything that is amiss. And I'm sure there will be many opportunities to do so. Thank you, General Holder, for your work. Jalen Rose is joining us. Jalen is former NBA player, and he is a celebrity spokesperson. His theme is more than a vote. More than a vote. Thank you, Mr. Rose, for joining us today. And finally, Mark Pedowitz. Mark is the chairman and CEO of CW Network, and you will hear all about his great work very soon. Thank you to the participants, and thank all of you for joining us today.
It is now my pleasure to welcome the moderator of today's discussion, the esteemed Angela Rye. Angela is the principal and CEO of Impact Strategies and an NPR political analyst. She's no stranger to the Congressional Black Caucus, having served as its former executive director and general counsel. She currently serves on the board of the Congressional Black Caucus Institute. Angela has been a leading voice in the fight for Black empowerment and equal voting rights in this country. I am so thrilled that she's serving as our moderator. Angela, take it away.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Sewell. It is always such a pleasure to be here with you, and I'm always so amazed at your constant fight for voting rights. I remember doing this same voting rights Braintrust with you and Congressman Lewis, and it was so beautiful to see this informal mentorship that developed between the two of you. And I know that he's got to be smiling down from heaven because you are definitely getting in good trouble. And some of that good trouble is getting this bill, H.R. 4, which we know is named after Congressman Lewis, passed after the Supreme Court didn't one time with gutting Section 5, but 2 times with gutting Section 2 most recently. It needed to be passed again. So 56 years after the Voting Rights Act was signed into law, here we are again, still in battle, and you're not tired. And you're here today with some amazing comrades in the fight that I have the great opportunity and privilege to introduce to you all. I will start with counselor to so many of us, the president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Sherilyn Ifill. Thank you for your fight. And it is such a joy and honor to be here moderating this conversation with you today. President and Executive Director of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, that is John C. Yang. Welcome, John. And my good brother, co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund. Y'all have seen them getting into good trouble recently too. Cliff Albright. And last but certainly not least, we have David Clooney, who is the Executive Director of Black Economic Alliance. And some folks would say they didn't know Black folks in business would get in some trouble, but we know David's been stirring it up. So we'll get into all of that. But first, I really just want to ground this conversation in truth. There's a lot of misinformation getting around on the internet these days, whether we're talking about COVID, COVID relief checks, and of course, our voting rights and what's really at stake. So here we are. 25 states have enacted 54 laws that actually expand voting access. On the contrary, there are more than 400 bills that have been introduced in 49 states that would roll back voting rights. And as of last month, 18 states have enacted 30 laws. I said lies, maybe that was a Freudian slip, to make it harder for us to vote. And I do want to acknowledge the CBC Foundation's 501c3 status. What I will say to you is that voting rights should not be partisan. So nobody's going to get in trouble today. We are all speaking our own opinions and telling you all what you need to do to protect democracy and protect your access to the ballot. And I want to start, Sherilyn, with you, really because I want to just ground us in where are we and how did we get here?
Thank you so much, Angela, and I'm grateful as well to Congresswoman Sewell for her advocacy and for the invitation to join this terrific panel today. This is such an important conversation, and I'm so glad you teed up that first question, because while I am thrilled that many more Americans in this moment understand what voter suppression is, perhaps than ever before, and why it is dangerous not only for Black and Brown communities, but for the integrity of American democracy. Not only is it targeted at language minorities, not only is it targeted at Asian American and Native American voters, but it is literally a threat to the integrity of American democracy. The other reason I'm really thrilled that you started with that question is because, I lead an organization founded by Thurgood Marshall. And when Marshall retired from being a Supreme Court justice, he was the first Black Supreme Court justice, he was asked what his most important case was. Now, I'm sure that both you and I would have thought he would answer Brown versus Board of Education, the landmark 1954 case that ended legal segregation in schools and began to take the brick out of the wall that crumbled legal segregation in this country. But Marshall actually said Smith versus Allwright, a case he won in the United States Supreme Court in 1944, when the court struck down the use of all white primary elections by the Democratic Party in Texas. And the reason I wanted to begin with that is because the issue of voter suppression against racial minorities in this country has never been a partisan issue. As a matter of fact, we have stayed in the same place we've been. It may be that certain political parties have moved, but we are saying the same things that we have been saying. I started my career as a voting rights attorney at the Legal Defense Fund in 1988. I have sued Republicans. I was part of the team that sued Bill Clinton when he was governor of Arkansas in a voting rights case. When the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized in 2006, the vote was 396 to 33 in the House and 98 to 0 in the Senate. That's just in 2006. But this is a dramatization of how far this country has moved and become so hyper-partisan in 2021 that there was not one Republican vote for H.R. 4. So that is not a partisan comment. That is simply a fact of what has happened. And I will not allow this issue to be painted into a partisan corner, because it is fundamentally about racism in our political system that has been with us from the founding of this country. And in fact, when we describe it in purely partisan terms, it allows people to turn away from the most toxic aspects of voter suppression. If it were understood in 2014, when Texas passed its voter ID law that allowed you to use a concealed gun carry permit as ID, but not your, our client's ID from their HBCU in Texas and not your tribal ID. If that had been understood at that moment as white supremacy, as racism, it might have changed the conversation earlier. But instead, all of this was discussed in partisan terms, which allowed people to see this as one side and the other side, and not as a fundamental threat to our democratic structure. So how did we get here? We got here in part by the failure to recognize that when an entire legislature meets, whether it's in Texas or in North Carolina, that year passed its omnibus voter suppression bill, and they meet to pass laws designed to keep Black and Brown and Asian American and Native American people from voting. That is white supremacy. It was white supremacy then. And when Georgia does it in 2021, when Texas does it in 2021, when Florida does it in 2021, it remains white supremacy. So we are litigating right now in both Georgia and Florida, and likely in Texas as well. We are continuing to do what we do. But the truth is that this issue has metastasized and has gotten so big that we must have federal legislation, new tools in our hand to be able to combat racist voter suppression. And that's what H.R. 4 is going to give us. It's going to return us to a period when certain jurisdictions with a history of discrimination cannot impose new voter laws that have the effect of discriminating against minority voters. But instead, those proposed laws have to be pre-cleared through a federal authority. This was a key issue that John Lewis understood needed to be passed. Congresswoman Sewell has been like a dog with a bone ever since the Shelby County versus Holder case in 2013, when the Supreme Court gutted the preclearance provision. And finally, this year in August, H.R. 4 passed in the House, and now it must pass in the Senate.
And speaking of that, I'm not going to call her a dog with a bone. I'm going to call her a queen with the crown. See the painting behind me, because she really has been. Sherilyn, she really has been. And so have you. You all have been fighting this fight consistently. When folks were tired of talking about voting rights, y'all have been right there. So Congresswoman, I want to come to you as the lead sponsor of H.R. 4. Talk to our community about what they need to know about this bill. We are in the middle of a pandemic, right? We really haven't gotten to the other side of it. There are still folks who are just struggling to make ends meet. And they're like, you want to talk to me about voting? And you're like, yeah, it's not necessarily guaranteed. So talk to us about some of the most important provisions that perhaps folks haven't turned an intentional blind eye to, but they just haven't been able to keep up because they're just trying to make ends meet.
Well, let me just say, Angela, old battles have become new again. While we no longer have to count how many marbles are in a jar, the modern day barriers to voting are no less pernicious. The reality is, if I'm in a dogfight, I want to be in the foxhole with Sherilyn, Ifill, with Tom, with all the folks that are on this panel, who are just amazing activists on behalf of the equal right to vote for all Americans. If you had told me that 56 years later, that I would have the same cause for which John Lewis marched, Amelia Boynton marched in Selma, Alabama on that bloody Sunday, I would have told you no way. But because old battles have become new again, progress we know is elusive. Every generation has to fight and fight again to not only maintain the progress that we've made, but to try to advance it. And every time we do make one step or two steps forward, there's a great possibility that we could have one or two steps backward. So we have to be ever vigilant when it comes to the fight for voting rights. When the Shelby versus Holder decision was decided in 2013, the Supreme Court, the Roberts Court, said that, Congress needed to come up with a modern day formula by which to determine which states have had a recent history of discrimination such that they would have to be pre-cleared by the Justice Department. And while we understand that federal oversight should be left for the most egregious actors, needless to say, what we saw in 2020 and 2021 and what we're witnessing right now is an onslaught, a concerted effort by certain state legislatures to make it harder for certain people to vote. So now more than ever, we need to put back the federal protection. Pre-clearance is the remedy for that protection. And in order to do that, we're now not going to look back to the 1960s or the 1970s. We're going to look back 25 years, 1996 and going forward. And if states have had adjudicated violations of voter discrimination, if they've had 10 or more, including one statewide violation, or if they've had 15 cases of adjudicated violations of voter discrimination, then those states must be pre-cleared. They must pre-clear any of their voting laws in order to make those laws become effective. And you know, that's the beauty of pre-clearance. It's prophylactic, right? It is a protection on the front end to make sure that these laws never come into effect if they're truly going to have a discriminatory effect or impact on minority voters. And so I'm excited because we not only protect the legacy that is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but we also advance it, because what we also know is that there are certain known practices that have come about that have a discriminatory impact. And so those known practices, and we identify 7 of them in the bill, should also require pre-clearance because they are so aligned, and so they give a discriminatory impact, and so they should have to have pre-clearance as well. So I look forward to not only protecting the legacy that is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but also advancing it, which is why we now call it the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, because we are not just protecting the VRA, we're advancing it as well. And we couldn't do it without the bright minds and the political activism of those on this panel. So I want to thank you, Angela, for the opportunity. And I want to just say that we know that even though we pass on partisan lines, as Sherilyn said, voting rights should be a nonpartisan issue. It has been in the past, and I'm just calling on the senators. I'm calling on all the senators, Democrats and Republicans alike, to pass the Voting Rights Act, the HR 4, and reinstitute the federal protection, and that is left for the most egregious of state actors. We're trying to thread a very thin needle. We think we've done that with HR 4, and we look forward to taking it to the Senate and getting it on the president's desk and signed into law.
I love that. Thank you, Congresswoman. John, I want to come to you because I think that sometimes we don't really engage in coalition building, and we see, and I will be the first to acknowledge, I very much see voting rights as a black and white issue. And when we do that, and I mean by race, when we do that, we leave out whole swaths of folks, indigenous communities, Asian American folks, AAPI folks that also are impacted in the same way, discriminated in the same way. What are some of the key issues in some of the state legislatures where there have been super suppressive laws that have been passed and also introduced that have come up that do impact the Asian community? And why is it so important that we stand in solidarity, not just around voting rights, but since the conversations on voting rights today, around voting rights?
Sure, I appreciate the question. I really appreciate being with all of my friends and colleagues here on this panel, because I think that's right, is that we have to build this as a coalition. For the Asian American community, there's a couple of points that I would bring up. One is, for you to think about it as a black and white issue, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because if you think about voter suppression here in the United States, in large part, it was directed at the African American community. So we should acknowledge that, and we should acknowledge that white supremacist culture and how that affected the African American community in direct relevance, right? So there's nothing, you shouldn't apologize about that. I think that's fair. If you look at the Asian American experience, to us, it's very resonant that in the same year that the Voting Rights Act was passed was the Immigration and Nationality Act. and which really allowed Asian Americans to come to the United States in larger numbers than we ever have before. Because prior to that, because of different racist quotas that we had, Asian Americans could not come here. So if you look at the 1960 census, the census just before the Voting Rights Act, only 0.5% of the American population were Asian Americans. Now, after the 2020 census, it's over 7%. So the relevance of the Asian American voter has just increased by that, right? So if you're talking about the laws themselves, we share so many of the same issues. Whether it is around voter ID laws, whether it is around polling access. One of the things that gets forgotten is that for Asian Americans, there were exit studies that were done for the 2020 elections. About 2/3 of our population wanted to vote early, wanted to vote by mail. When you actually had the polls themselves, in Georgia and Arizona, Asian Americans outperformed compared to other racial and ethnic groups with respect to actually voting by mail. So when you're talking about restrictive legislation, suppressive legislation that restricts voting by mail, restricts voting early, that directly affects the Asian American community. Let me draw another through line to that. Why is that? Well, among other things, as Sherilyn mentioned, Asian Americans specifically have language access issues. So for us, voting at home, where we have an opportunity to get translations that we understand, that are culturally competent, makes a difference. We all know the idea of going to the polling place can be very daunting for any American, not just Asian Americans. But if you have a language issue, if you have other cultural issues that affect that will make a huge difference. The last thing I would say, going back to how important this is and how this resonates for our community is, I'll be very direct about this. If you think about Asian American immigration to the United States, many of us immigrated to the United States precisely because we're escaping autocratic regimes, precisely as because we want to come to a democracy where our voice mattered. So this notion that we come to this place, this land of freedom, and yet our voices get stifled, goes to precisely what everyone else on this panel is saying, is that is the exact symbol of white supremacy.
That is so good. I want to come to you, David, because there was something that was done in the business community led by Black execs before we were recording. Congresswoman Sewell said this, all the business community, but I want to give credence and honor to the Black execs that stepped up and led the way, particularly in Georgia. And I want to just hear from you why it was important to weigh in now. And honestly, David, what took so long? Because Congressman Sewell been fighting this a long time. It's been like some quiet, we with you, sis. But all of a sudden, it was like letters and there was real advocacy. What happened? What changed?
Let me answer the second part of your question first. Why did it take so long? Vernon Jordan, when he was blessing the formation of the Black Economic Alliance just a few years ago in 2018, essentially said there had not been a critical mass of senior Black leaders in the corporate community, in the business community, who had agency and who were willing to use that agency to fight for better rights for their community. We absolutely have that critical mass now. And he said we have to use this platform we have to improve conditions for the many people who do not have the platform that we have. So I can also say I'm honored to be on the screen with all of you, particularly Representative Sewell, but really all of the civil rights giants on the screen. But Sherilyn Ifill in particular was instrumental in that particular act, picking up the phone and calling a number of Black CEOs and saying, you all paying attention to what's going on? And somebody needs to say something. Somebody needs to get through to folks and call a different type of attention to this issue. So in a relatively short period of time, that set in motion a number of phone calls among Black CEOs calling each other, and then putting together in the space of just a few days, a full page ad in the New York Times to essentially say, everybody needs to pay attention to what is happening. This is absolutely rooted in a history of racial discrimination and white supremacy. And the business community has a voice to speak with. And quite honestly, we live in a capitalist society. So the corporate community and business community perhaps has the most power to speak with our elected officials. And they speak with their dollars. Citizens United said that corporations are people and they have a political voice and they use it freely and willingly when they want to. But then the other piece of this is in the last year and a half, we've seen companies make unprecedented rhetorical and financial commitments to racial equity. They've said Black Lives Matter. They've said they want to be a part of the solution, not the problem. They said they've had a so-called racial reckoning. And they said they're going to use their platforms every way they can to improve conditions for their stakeholders, including their employees, the communities they serve, and Black people in every way that they touch them. So we have connected those commitments and those rhetorical and financial commitments to this as an opportunity for them to put action to those words. And it's an ongoing struggle because some folks have not seen a connection and they say, is this really about race? Explain to me how this is, this is not a literacy test. This is not the same. And we have to kind of remind folks the feeling they had those first 2 weeks after George Floyd's murder, and then let's call it the first 2 weeks of June last year, where they were reading books, asking questions, texting, and calling every Black person they knew and saying, I'm sorry, tell me what I can do. Go back to that feeling you had in those first 2 weeks after George Floyd's murder and figure out how you can use your platform to be a part of the solution and not the problem. That's what the Black execs were calling attention to, and that's what the Black Economic Alliance has been working with a large coalition of folks to call attention to.
I love what you said, David. Cliff, I'm coming to you, but I have a quick follow-up. David, are they going to keep that same energy for the filibuster so we can get Ms. Sewell's bill passed? That's all I want to know. We need that same energy, David.
So TBD. And I will say, let's believe in hope over experience, because it has been a daunting process trying to get buy-in on that particular issue. But that's yet another place where we have to tie the reality of the racial injustice that has been tied to the use of the filibuster over time to where we are now and how it plays out and why it is so important that we alter and or do away with the filibuster. So stay tuned. We have to keep our ear, really shoulder to the wheel and keep working at it. So I look forward to hopefully making some progress on that front as well.
I'm gonna hold you to it. I'm gonna cut this one up and put it on the gram. David, since we're using acronyms, Cliff, I'm gonna come to you with the WAP, and I'm not talking about Cardi B song. I'm talking about We Ain't Playing. WAP, we ain't playing. Y'all have not been playing, Cliff. You guys have been in these streets, getting to folks who, for the first time in their lives, understand their power. And it isn't just around them casting a vote for an elected official that we all might know and love. It really is about understanding how essential they are to shaping this country into what we want it to become. And you all have been front and center in that. Cliff, talk about how important it is for folks to not only use their taxpayer dollars to see change, to not only vote to see change, but also to mobilize and ensure that our elected officials, when they're not like-minded like Terri Sewell, I'm gonna use some others, since we are nonpartisan and we've been talking a lot about what Republican-led state legislatures have done. I'm gonna just throw out, Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema. Why have you all been applying pressure to them in this way, and talk about what really needs to happen around the filibuster? People have been tiptoeing around it, but WAP, David. So Cliff, go ahead, let us know.
Yeah, the filibuster got to go, or as we said in DC the other day, the filibuster got to go. At the end of the day, it's important, and thank you, Angela, for the question. It's important for us to remember that in 1965, Lyndon Johnson did not want to pass the Voting Rights Act. He didn't think it was the right time. He thought the cost would be too high, but it was our movement. It was our movements in Alabama. It was our movements in Mississippi and so many other places that forced Lyndon B. Johnson. It was Representative Sewell's hometown of Selma, Alabama, that forced Lyndon B. Johnson into greatness and into pushing and passing the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which we are currently trying to restore. That's our history. That's what our history shows us. And so in this moment, as we are trying to now deal with the voting rights battle of this generation, we have got to be willing to do at least as much. We just celebrated the 1960 or commemorated the 1963 march, and a lot of people have been talking about Dr. King's I Have a Dream, but I keep telling people the thing that I have on my mind isn't the words that he spoke that day, but it's the words that he wrote a few months earlier when he wrote that letter from Birmingham jail, where he laid out, where he did an entire dissertation on the process, the rationale, and the purpose of nonviolent direct action, including civil disobedience. That's what we need in this moment. That's what you need when you're going up against the filibuster that's been blocking voting rights and civil rights, not just for 5 or 10 years, but literally since 1874, when they used it to block civil rights laws at that time. When you're going up against something as old as the filibuster, as old as voter suppression, which in fact is as old as this country itself, when you're going up against something like that, you've got to be willing to use the process of nonviolent civil disobedience in order to create the kind of tension that Dr. King talked about in that letter. That's what we've been doing. That's what members of the Congressional Black Caucus, we've had 4 members of the Congressional Black Caucus. I'm so proud that what we talk about is the conscience of the Congress isn't just the conscience, but they're actually out there doing the work. We've had 4 members get arrested with us out in these streets at Senate offices. We've had the members of the CBC pushing this legislation from on the House side, of course, with Congresswoman Sewell, on the Senate side with Senator Warnock, who Black voters helped put in that position. But we've got to be willing to create this kind of creative tension, because as Dr. King tells us, that tension is necessary in order for us to move the process forward. It's like a rubber band. Think about a rubber band. When you stretch that rubber band and you try to shoot it, that rubber band can't go forward until you create that tension. Or maybe the rubber band is not a strong enough image for you. So maybe it's not a rubber band. Maybe it's a slingshot. And maybe your name is is David, and you're trying to take down a giant named Goliath or a giant named the filibuster. You got to be willing to create that tension before you can go forward towards your objective. That's what we need to. I would love to see, and what we are calling for is over the next few weeks, ongoing civil disobedience, locking arms, blocking doors, blocking intersections. We'd love to see the members, David, of the business community go on and do what the CBC members have done and get arrested with us in these streets. Or maybe even some of these companies that would give their employees time to demonstrate for the Voting Rights Act, or maybe to even offer to pay the bail if they've got people engaging in nonviolent, righteous civil disobedience, right? Not the hateful civil disobedience that some other folk did on January 6th, but the nonviolent, righteous civil disobedience. I'd love to see the business community get involved in that. I'd love to see other elected officials, because that's what it's going to take to get us where we need to get to on voting rights, to end this filibuster. And yes, we need to do it not just in DC, but in West Virginia, Senator Manchin, and in Arizona, Senator Sinema, and in Delaware, Senator Coons. And so this is, as we keep saying, we got to speak to both sides, because we need both sides to do right, but we got a particular message for those that we have put in power, who we put in power, who are supposed to be our advocates for voting rights. We need them to use the power that we've given them, and it's going to take ongoing civil disobedience to do that. And I believe more than ever, I believe that we will win.
I believe we will win too. You're such a happy warrior, Cliff. I love you and Latasha are always that way, and you never sound tired. I'm so grateful for that. Really quickly, we have 5 minutes remaining because time is cheating us today. And this is when we need a filibuster, right? We need to go a little longer. But if I can just do a rapid round with each of you. Cliff has given us some marching orders. What do you want to tell the folks who are tuning in? They're not sure what to do. They're not sure their best way to weigh in. Maybe it's a directive, Sherilyn and John, to your legal colleagues in this space. What do you need folks to do to make sure that we actually do win this fight once and for all? And Sherilyn, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you all. You've re-inspired me. Listen, civil rights lawyers can only work with the tools that are made available to them. We need stronger tools in our hand. We need this legislation. We're up to our neck in litigation, and we're not going to stop litigating. But we've got the Supreme Court weakening the Voting Rights Act, even while we're in the middle of litigating. So we need this bill. It's going to strengthen the Voting Rights Act, but we need you to put that pressure on your senators. You need to call 202-224-3121. If you're not out on the street protesting, it's 202-224-3121. Call your members of the Senate, both your members of the Senate. Don't tell me I'm in a red state or a blue state. Call them. Go to our website, www.naacpldf.org. Sign up for one of our redistricting trainings in the South so you can learn about gerrymandering and redistricting. This is about our power over the next 10 years. And lastly, I need you to vote in your local elections. There are elections happening every year. There were elections last week in Birmingham for mayor, for city council, for school board. You see these school boards passing these laws that are trying to keep us from telling the truth about race in this country. I need you to refocus. Elections don't happen every 2 years. They don't happen every 4 years. They happen every year. Find out what local elections are happening in your jurisdiction. Find out what the offices are and what those officials do. Find out who are the candidates that are most aligned with your values and that you believe can help your community, and vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherilyn. John, I'm gonna come to you. Y'all, let's keep it to 1 minute. Congresswoman, I'm not skipping over you. I'm gonna come to you last so you can wrap up your Braintrust first panel. John, I'll go to you.
The wonderful thing about following Sherilyn is all I could do and all I need to do is say amen. Absolutely. And don't minimize the power of your own voice. Don't minimize the power of your own actions, because all of that really does build that ripple, does build that tide, builds that wave to make it a tsunami that the members of Congress, the senators, cannot ignore. I can't overemphasize that enough. The last thing I would say is, I agree with Sherilyn, absolutely, is you got to think about the local. You got to think about sort of also just having those retail conversations with your friends, with your family that agree with you, but might not be willing to do something about it, or just haven't thought about, what difference does one voice make? That one voice makes a difference if that one voice also convinces another one voice, convinces another one voice. That's how change happens.
So good, David.
Thank you for letting me be on this panel. And I'm re-energized as well. And I would say amen to everything that has been said before. And I'll only add, particularly to the business community, but to individuals as well. And John alluded to this point. Be stewards and ambassadors of good information. There's a lot of disinformation and misinformation out there. I encourage people to steer people toward good information. Make sure that folks know that there was no voter fraud in 2020. The Trump-led Department of Homeland Security called it the most secure election in American history, because it was. Tell folks to learn about the history of the filibuster. Get good information out there. Use every platform you have. Encourage others to counteract misinformation when it's out there. And that will really help steer this conversation in a more positive direction. And that's part of what we're asking the business community to do, because they talk to their employees, their stakeholders, their communities, and they need to get good information out there and not look the other way when they know something is a lie and that 400 plus bills are being moved on the basis of a lie. Thank you for having me.
David, I'm just going to remind you that the new acronym today is We Ain't Playing, and we're asking you to send that to them straight from Cliff Albright. I'm just going to close out, and then I'll go to Congresswoman Sewell.
Yeah, if my dear friend, Sister Comrade Latasha was on here right about now, she'd probably sing a couple of lines from Eyes on the Prize. I'm not going to do you a favor. I'm not going to sing it, but I'm just going to deliver that message that if we keep our eyes on the prize, if we have the faith that's in the grain of a mustard seed, then we can move mountains. We just got to remember, we've got the power. If we believe that, then we will get the victory on the voting rights that we deserve.
And to our modern day voting rights champion who just got HR 4 across the finish line again with some additional changes we need, Congresswoman Sewell, the floor is yours.
Listen, I think that our panelists have said it best. Change rarely comes in the halls of Congress. They come on the streets of America through grassroots activism, through collective coalition building, to making sure that we are all on the right side of history when it comes to voting rights. I just want to say that when I think about HR 4, it's not just about restoring federal oversight. It's not just about reinstituting pre-clearance. It's also about clarifying Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is the most seminal and the most consequential piece of legislation in the 21st century. And it only makes sense when you think about the fact that every American should have an equal access to the ballot box. At the end of the day, your vote is your voice in this democracy, and everyone's voice should matter. When I think about restoring the vote, VOTE, I want us to remember that we're restoring VOTE, the voices of the excluded. We need to step up and do that. We need to be writing our senators. We need to be in the streets with civil, nonviolent protests around voting rights. And we need to go to the ballot box and vote in each election, federal, state, and local elections. And please bring 5 folks with you when you go to vote. It's critically important that we step up and we do that, not just for the future generations, but we do that for the legacy of John Lewis and Amelia Boynton Robinson and those people on whose shoulders we now stand. I am often reminded of what Amelia Boynton Robinson said when everyone came up to her and said, "Oh, we stand on your shoulders. We stand on your shoulders." She said, "Get off my shoulders and do your own work." I want to conclude by saying we can do our own work by passing HR 4 in the Senate, by reforming the filibuster to do that, and by getting HR 4 on the desk of President Biden so that he can sign it into law. Let's do our part to further the legacy, to get into some good trouble. Let's do our part.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I want to thank this illustrious panel for joining us. I wish we had more time. It just means there needs to be another voting rights Braintrust, Congresswoman, not during ALC, and we can do that hopefully later on this year. Sherilyn, to John, to David, and to Cliff, thank you all so much for all of the wisdom that you dropped today. We look forward to continue this movement and getting this bill passed. We ain't playing, David.
Our next co-host is Senator Warnock, Georgia's first Black United States Senator, who served as the senior pastor of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. As his state ushers in sweeping voter restrictions, Senator Warnock has been a tireless advocate for the right of all Georgians and all Americans to have their voices heard at the ballot box. Senator Warnock.
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry that scheduling would not permit me to be there with you for this live conversation. But indeed, we are focused now on one of our country's most sacred and fundamental rights, the right to vote. I want to thank Congresswoman Sewell and Congressman Butterfield for allowing me to co-host this important conversation. I also want to thank the CBC Foundation for providing the forum to bring all of us together so that we might have this important dialogue. And as I've said on the floor of the Senate and to people in every corner of my state, Congress must pass voting rights no matter what. Voting rights are preservative of all other rights. That means that we have to do everything we can to defend the voices of the people in our democracy. And right now, can there be any question at all that our democracy is under attack? In many ways, last November's election could be viewed as our nation's most successful election, not because of who won, but because of who showed up. We had the largest turnout of any election. And since last November, and since my election in January, more than 400 voter suppression bills have been introduced in 49 states. 18 states have passed 30 laws to restrict voting access. My home state of Georgia is ground zero for voter suppression. Earlier this year, Georgia's state legislature passed SB 202, making it harder to vote for countless Georgians by creating hurdles for voters to request an absentee ballot, by reducing the number of drop boxes where voters can return their ballots, by making it harder for community organizations to assist voters, and by making it possible for a single person, imagine that, a single person to make unlimited challenges to the ability of other Georgians to vote. And as if that weren't enough, Georgia's law also allows partisan actors at the state level to control our state board of elections and take over local elections, which they are threatening to do right now. And it allows them to engage in these takeovers even while the votes are still being cast. Our federal government and Congress specifically must act. It is our duty. It is our responsibility. It is within our purview. We must pass federal voting rights protections to provide a national baseline for voting, basic standards that apply no matter what state you live in. And that's why I'm working so hard right now for voting rights in the Senate. Because voting rights is not just an issue alongside other issues. And so I'm working hard with my colleagues in the Senate to get this done. And I know that all of you are standing with me in this fight. We do this work together. And so as I conclude my remarks, I think of Congressman John Lewis. He inspired me in life, and his witness speaks even from the grave. As I was preparing last summer to preside over his funeral, and I thought about the footage that many of us have seen time and time again of him crossing that Edmund Pettus Bridge, I asked myself, what was John Lewis thinking? In fact, what was Hosea Williams thinking as they crossed that Edmund Pettus Bridge? I assure you that he was not thinking about winning a Presidential Medal of Freedom. That's not why he did it. He was not thinking that somehow he would walk into glory and that at the end of his life, at his funeral, 3 American presidents would show up on both sides of the aisle to pay him homage. He could not have imagined that. John Lewis stood up for voting rights because it was the right thing to do. He was inspired by the words of Dr. King, who in 1957 said, "Give us the ballot, and we will place on the benches in the South judges who will do justice and love mercy. And we will place at the head of Southern states governors who have not only felt the tang of the human, but the glow of the divine." This is a critical moment, and our country is at an inflection point. Similar to the one we faced in 1965. Make no mistake, we are in a 911 emergency for our democracy. History is watching us. The future is waiting to see if we will act. So thank you again to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Thanks to our sponsors, Congresswoman Sewell, Congressman Butterfield, and this esteemed panel. And thank you for the work that you are doing in this moment to preserve and strengthen our democracy. Let's stay in this fight until the victory is won.
Now we are in panel 2 of our Voting Rights Braintrust, again hosted by Congresswoman Terri Sewell, our modern day voting rights champion. I'm going to start with who I'm going to say she's my governor. This is Stacey Abrams, the chair of Fair Fight Action. We also have, as Congresswoman Sewell said, off camera, our forever Attorney General, Eric Holder, who is now also the chair of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. We have Mark Pedowitz, who is the chairman and CEO of CW Television Network. And last but certainly not least, my brother and friend, a member of the best basketball squad ever, the Fab Five back in the day, a former NBA player, celebrity spokesperson for More Than a Vote, Jalen Rose. Thank you all so much for being here. So we're going to just jump right in. We out here fighting, y'all. And speaking of fighting, I want to start with someone who's trying to engage us in a fair fight. But Stacey, they're not playing fair. So tell us how we can do that in this day and age with more than 400 voter suppression laws being introduced in states all over the country, including your own. What's fair about that fight?
There's nothing fair about the fight, which is why we exist. And Angela, I want to say thank you to you and certainly to Representative Sewell for your extraordinary leadership. It's an honor to be on this panel. Very quickly, what we need to recognize is that we are at a turning point in democracy. This isn't just about winning elections. This is about the fundamental nature of the kind of country we want to be. And we have, over the last 20 years, watched stable democracies fall to authoritarianism. We pretend that that could never happen to us, and we know it's not true. What we are fighting for are 3 things. One is the right to vote, which undergirds the nature of democracy. And that is made very clear through the fight against those 400 bills you referenced, and thus the fight for the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that the House has passed. But the second part, you get the right to vote and you secure it. The second part is having the right to elect the people who represent you. And that's the work that Attorney General Holder is doing, the work that we've been doing through Fair Count, a second organization I founded that really looks at who do we get to pick. And then the third piece is really pushing back against the subversion of our democracy. The bills that we are seeing passing in Texas, in Georgia, in Iowa, these laws will allow them to overturn elections. And if we forget, the goal of January 6th was the subversion of our democracy. And thus, if we do not stand up and pass these bills, that will push back against the attempt to not only stop us from participating, but to take away our choices and then to silence our voices once we've made a decision, we will not only not have a fair fight, we will no longer have a democracy that's worth speaking of in this country.
Wow. And I want to come to you, Mark, because Stacey raised some excellent points, but the last thing she ended with, the third point that she's fighting against, is the subversion of democracy. We saw that happen on January 6th, as she referenced. what is the role of business leaders and in particular the media in ensuring that there is an accurate story that's told, that people are clear about just how fragile democracy is? What role are you playing in that? And what are you urging your peers to do to ensure that we are actually protecting voting rights and protecting democracy itself?
First, let me thank Congresswoman Sewell for inviting me to join this conversation today and her tireless efforts to work on voting rights. And congratulations on the CBC Foundation on its 50th annual conference. I can't tell you about other companies. I can only tell you about the CW. And we believe through our programming about CW good situation, and we've taken on many a social cause, that last year we did the Vote Actually campaign to get people to register to vote. And I think we had a small part of that. But because of our reach, where we have 98% of the country we can broadcast to, because of our local affiliates, because of our social media stance, because of our digital, and because we have the youngest skewing audience in broadcast television, we have the ability to create an echo chamber that hopefully works. We started our campaign, in particular, Freedom to Vote. We wanted to make sure it was nonpartisan. So we partnered up with Vote.org and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the law. We felt that their guidance to help put a campaign together was important. We announced it on the 56th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. We have our PSAs with over 20 of our stars going on all of our platforms, including our local affiliates, which we hope will have the greatest impact, because this is strictly a local issue that becomes a national issue. In terms of ourselves, we believe that we can make a difference. From a personal basis, for myself, I'm old enough in this group to actually remember as a child the Freedom Riders. And I remember as a second grader contributing to those brave individuals who helped make the Voting Rights Act a possibility. I believe voting is a fundamental right for a healthy functioning democracy. But most importantly, we have now seen in the short moments of our campaign, 4 million impressions. We have activated 500,000 people. The response that we've received, 94% of it is positive. The other 6% is just, you're getting too political, despite the fact that it was nonpartisan. So I am proud to where the CW has stepped in this particular area. And I hope other companies reach out. My parent companies are Viacom CBS and as yours, Angela, is Time Warner, Warner Media, AT&T. I hope they too step up and do stuff, but they are fully aware of our campaign and they have said, go for it. And to them, I thank them for allowing us to do that.
Thank you so much, Mark. That is so impressive. I want to turn to you, Attorney General Holder, for a number of reasons. I think one, there is a case that we talked about on the first panel, Shelby versus Holder, that of course bears your name, but not your legacy, right? And I think that there's so much that you have continued to do since leaving the Department of Justice to not only protect our voting rights, but really helping people to understand the full strength of our power. While most of the discussion today has been has centered around HR 4, of course, where Congresswoman Sewell is the lead sponsor, there's also another bill that's been in contention, HR 1, that is, of course, has passed the House, that has drawn a little bit of ire because of the nonpartisan redistricting commissions. And I know you and our members know you and trust you, but there are some people in their states that they don't fool with like that. So I want to talk about why it's so important for us to turn our attention to redistricting, why it's so important that these lines are drawn maybe in a nonpartisan manner or a bipartisan manner. Why does that matter? And how can we ensure that CBC members are protected and can feel more comfortable around this? I have lots of other questions, including the importance of the census and all that, but I want to make sure I get this question in first, because it is really a split issue with the CBC. And then that way, Jake, it's not partisan.
Yeah. Yeah, well, first, let me thank you all for inviting me here today. Representative Sewell, you know, you're one of my favorite people in Congress. Angela, it's always good to be with you and with the other members of the panel. Jalen, I'd like to talk to you about some of your opinions that I see on ESPN. I don't always agree with you, but you know, but I love your basketball. I love your basketball, though. And Stacey, great to see you. Mark as well. You know, one of the things I'd start with is I think what Stacey said is really important. I'm not sure that we have, you know, at the beginning of the Obama years, we were focused on healthcare, a clearly very important issue. You know, the most important issue that confronts us now is the nature of our system, whether or not we are going to protect our democracy. You know, we for a long time assumed that what has happened in other countries could not happen here. And I think the reality is that what we are seeing now and what we saw on January the 6th is a warning sign. It's a very big warning sign. You know, if you look at history, and you got to understand history if you want to prevent the negative parts of it from repeating, you have to understand that the rise of authoritarianism in Europe in the middle part or the early part of the 20th century didn't happen because authoritarian types were strong. It's because democracies were weak or democracies were not protected. And we should take that as an object lesson. We've got to do everything we can to protect our democracy. Among the things that we have to do is in this process that we are now involved in, this whole notion of redistricting, we've got to try to make sure that is done in as fair a way as is possible. We saw gerrymanders that occurred in 2011 that have lasted over the course of a decade and have kept one party in power. Far beyond the number of votes that party received. And we've seen this happen on both sides. You know, both sides have engaged in gerrymandering as long as, you know, we have been a republic, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing or something that we should continue. And there's not a tension for all those folks who are concerned about, well, what is fairness going to mean for members of the Black Caucus? You know, what does that mean for minority representation at the state level and at the federal level? There's not a tension between adequate representation of communities of color, communities that want to be considered in their entirety. There's not a tension between that and fairness. In fact, I would argue that if you have a fair system, people of color, people in minority communities will do just fine. It is the misuse of our system in drawing these lines in a partisan way that has kept power away from communities that they deserve. So what I've tried to dedicate myself towards in my time since I left office as Attorney General is, again, fighting for fairness in the system. Now, people can quibble about or have legitimate arguments about whether or not we should go to independent commissions. I think the most important part of what was H.R. 1 is banning partisan gerrymandering. That, I think, is the most important thing. We still have in federal law a ban on racial gerrymandering. We need to have in federal law a ban on partisan gerrymandering. And then we can talk about what the mechanism should be. If people are not happy with having independent commissions, something that I think is a pretty good idea, I can understand that. The focus, though, should be on a ban on partisan gerrymandering. Let the lines be drawn in such a way so that at the end of the day, voters will pick their politicians, pick their representatives, as opposed to politicians choosing who their voters are going to be.
That's such a powerful point. Jalen, I know you have opinions, including one on whether or not attorney general holders should respect your opinions on ESPN. He didn't say shut up and dribble, but he was damn close.
I saw him play ball now. I done seen him play ball. And I seen you in the Oval Office standing next to an important lefty and said, "This is what I do. This is what I do."
Well, Jalen, today you are not giving an opinion on basketball. You are talking about voting, but I also want to acknowledge something that's really key here. You all have more than a vote. You have always used your influence to ensure that Black folks understood their power. And you did that on the court. You did that by shaving your head. You did that with black Nike socks. You know, I had some. We've had this conversation. There's so many ways that you've used your influence for good. You have a lot of opinions about all the things that are happening politically. I do want to hear from you on why it was so important for you to lend your voice to this, to our voting processes, to protecting democracy, to ensuring that Black folks never sacrifice their power again, especially when it's not by our choice. It's because some folks are afraid of what happens when we have that power.
I'm extremely honored to be here today, and I could take up the next 30 minutes applauding each of you. I'm huge fans of each of you. I'm extremely honored to be here, and I just want you guys to know I'm here to support in any way, shape, or form, because the work each of you are doing is terrific. And again, I'm really honored to be here. The one thing that I learned growing up in the inner city of Detroit is there were a couple of people who had huge influences. And the notorious big one said, either you sling crack rock or you got a wicked jump shot. And in a couple of weeks on Stars, y'all gonna see a documentary about BMF. They're from my hometown. I went to Detroit Southwestern. While they were starring in the streets, I was starring playing basketball. And what ends up happening is those become the powerful voices in the community. Now, how you use that influence varies over your career. And for me, I always wanted to give back to my community in every way that I could, because I understood that the quality of our education was defined, unfortunately, by our zip codes. So every chance I got, every step I took, every team I played for, I always had a foundation. I always gave back to public school students. I have an endowment at the University of Michigan that has graduated a couple of students. I've always tried to use basketball. I always talk about there's the score of the game, and then there's the game of life. And what ends up happening as a Black athlete, I started to realize my athletics, and when I score 35 points, that's a headline. But if I make the honor roll, nobody's really giving me love for that. Like, I appreciated being a member of the Fab Five, and I'm glad we were able to make history, but I made the dean's list. I took pride in being a student, and I started to realize that I have to now use that influence for other young people who not only want to be an athlete like me, but also wanted to be appreciated for their intellect. So I never wanted to be considered a dumb jock. I never wanted to be only about sports, only about basketball. So shut up and dribble was never in my vocabulary, because I was talking the whole time and trying to do both. Give back to my community, play the game I love, and then something happened. And this is an epiphany that happens in everybody's career. This probably should have happened when I was 5 years old, but I can't lie to you guys. It probably happened when I was 21. I finally realized that I wasn't going to be Magic Johnson. I was like, oh no, I can't believe it. I'm not Magic? Like, what? Right? And so I decided at that moment, I'm going to be Magic in other areas of my life, and started to teach young people how to own things that don't cost anything. Because I remember being poor, and I remember how that made me feel. And sometimes it makes you feel useless, voiceless, defenseless, or like somebody that's trying to get their vote suppressed by 400 laws that have just passed since an election happened. And so it's important to use the platform, to use your voices. I'm going to continue to use mine. And again, I'm available to support in any way, shape, or form.
I love that, Jalen. I want to come to you, Stacey. Jalen just mentioned the 400 laws that, of course, have been introduced in states all around the country. And you talked about the importance of us having the right to elect who we want. I think that's a key piece of this issue, right? When folks at home are watching this, they're thinking about how folks always come to me when they need my vote, but they're not worried about me. They don't care about me any other time. We're seeing some of that same issues, or some of those same issues in the Senate right now. There are folks who, people were asked to donate to, folks were asked to knock on doors for, and all of a sudden, those folks are ghosts when it comes time to talk about protecting the voting rights of not only Black Americans, but several marginalized communities. So can you talk about what it looks like to have the right, to have the freedom to elect who we want, and why it's important for you to lean in around that point?
Thank you. Well, Jalen talked about the power that we have that we don't see. And one of the powers we have as voters is the ability to change leadership. but it's one of the few collective powers that really only works when other people use it. One person voting, one person playing a game doesn't win. You've got to have everybody on the team doing it. And one of the opportunities we have with this set of votes with HR 1 and HR 4 is that our collective power can sway the outcome. I just want to push people's minds back. When the HR 1 passed out of the House, and I want to give Congresswoman Sewell so much credit for getting it through there. When it got out of the House and made it to the Senate, it was declared dead on arrival. We then saw 50 senators vote to keep it alive. And then before they went on recess, we saw 50 senators vote to keep it alive again. But what's happened in that interregnum is that we've been calling. And I want to encourage, and this is the first piece, call your senators. Regardless of how they say they're going to vote, they want to stay in office. They like their jobs. And Terri and I can tell you, politicians, the most terrifying thing for a politician is a constituent who knows how to find you if you're not doing the right thing. And that means that you've got to do good. You've got to be there. And this goes to AG Holder's point. You don't get to, politicians don't get to pick their voters. And when voters pick their politicians, you may not have the one you want, but the one you get still has to work for you. And so the phone number we encourage people to call is 833-465-7142. 833-465-7142. You call that number, it's a switchboard that will send you directly to your US Senator. And let's be clear, there's some names that are floating out there as the reason this isn't moving, but there are a lot of folks who are hiding behind those two folks. So we need every senator to be held accountable. And if you know your senators are going to do the right thing, call them and say thank you. And if you don't know what they're going to do, call them and tell them what you need them to do. So that's the first part. The second part is to call again. There's nothing we do one time and we think it's done. Everything we really want, Jalen can tell you, practice makes perfect. Practice also makes change. And so we've got to keep calling. Until they take action, they need to be terrified that we won't go away. And the reason that matters is that when you hear one noise, if that noise disappears, then you think, okay, that's done. But when that noise becomes a shout and that shout becomes a siren and that siren stays loud, you will do anything in your power to make it go away. And in this case, to make the siren call of authoritarianism disappear, we have to keep pushing for democracy to win. And these two bills are the only way to get it done. The last thing I'll say is this. We can't underestimate the importance of not only fighting on this national level, but those state legislators in those 49 states pushing those bills are the same ones who are going to be drawing the lines for redistricting, as AG Holder pointed out. They're going to be drawing the lines that decide how you get to vote for the next 10 years. And so as much as we have to pay attention on the national level to what the CBC is going to be doing so hard to make sure we pass HR 1 and HR 4, we also have to be paying attention to all of those redistricting committees that are going to be meeting starting in September to draw the lines for your new legislative districts. But that's also your city council districts, your school board districts. All of those choices get made by redistricting. Those are our three levers of power: calling, calling again, and making sure we're calling on every level of government to do their job.
That's $1 million question right there. Let me ask, and I'm going to come to you, Congresswoman, and to you, AG Holder, on this. So September is when they meet to start drawing the lines. Is it too late for HR 1? What is the benefit of passing HR 1 now? We know it's the right thing to do. There are a number of changes that could be used to help strengthen folks' ability and opportunity to vote in the next election, but will it be too late for the redistricting process this year? And it only comes around every 10 years.
No, well, the short answer is it's not too late. The reality is that you will not have, you'll have about roughly half of the line drawing done by about the end of the year, but it won't be done until towards the end of the year in most states. There are a couple of states that are going to do things relatively quickly over the course of the next 45 days starting September the 1st. But there are a substantial number of states that will not be engaged in the process. And we also should not buy into the notion that if somehow or other a bill is passed after a redistricting process has been gone through and they do things inconsistent with the passage of that bill, that bill can simply be ignored. If nothing else, that would give me the basis to get into court and to sue a state that says, well, we're not going to pay any attention to that bill, even though what we've done is inconsistent with what the bill says. But I also think that something that Stacey said is extremely important and something I think the nation owes a debt of gratitude to her for, and that is to focus, to tell people we've got to focus on things that happen at the state level, at the local level. You know, we get all excited about who's going to be president, senator. You know, we get focused on the federal level, and the reality is that the things that affect people's lives on a day-to-day basis, more often than not, are happening at the state level. Not the least of which is the drawing of congressional districts. That's happening at the state level. People in Congress don't draw the lines. People at the state level draw it, and so Stacey's point, I think, is extremely important. We need to be focused, engaged, calling, making sure that we make people understand, people in power understand what it is that we want. But the people we need to be calling are people at the state level as well as people at the federal level.
And, you know, I think that what A.G. Holder said is absolutely right. And the whole cornerstone of this panel has been that you see people using their platform, their voice, to give voice to others by making sure that they vote. And it was John Lewis who said that the vote is the most effective nonviolent tool in our democracy. And so, you know, as a woman who grew up in Selma, Alabama, I have to tell you, I never would have thought that 56 years after Bloody Sunday, that the cause for which those foot soldiers marched, bled, as John said, gave a little blood on a bridge, that it would become our cause too. But it just goes to show you that the pendulum swings back and forth. And we have to be vigilant, ever vigilant, to make sure that we're doing all that we can to make sure that every voice in this democracy is heard. Your vote is your voice. And so no one's voice should be silenced. And so in terms of H.R. 4, for me, I think it's about making sure we have federal oversight again. I think that we saw it in the 1960s and 1970s when states weren't doing right. We would go to federal court, and federal court gave us, gave us the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And through their efforts, federal court helped us get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so I think that history repeats itself if we don't do something about it. And I think that we can learn from the Moses generation, John Lewis and Amelia Boynton Robinson, and so many wonderful people who fought. These were tacticians, they were strategists, and it's really about taking it to the people. Rarely does laws, changes in the halls of Congress. We don't really make the changes. It's that those changes bubble up from the grassroots activism. And so I think it's really important to see on this panel, you see Jalen Rose using his platform as an athlete to talk about the right to vote. We see Mr. Petway talk about the importance of media and how they're leveraging their platform to encourage people to vote. But it really is dependent upon each and every one of us to do our part and to realize that our vote does matter. Look at Georgia, for example. Would you ever think that we would have a Black senator and a Jewish senator? It's because people went out and they voted. Their vote counts. Your vote matters. And let's just take it to our senators and ask them to please vote for H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. If it takes only 51 votes to appoint a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court, but it takes 60 votes in order to stop debate, in order to get the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, or to get H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. We have to say that these archaic procedural rules must go, and that what we need is a Senate that will help us exercise our right to vote. And that's exactly what H.R. 4 would do and H.R. 1 would do, and what so many of these panelists are doing right now by using their platform to really encourage people to get out there and vote.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Mark, I want to come to you. There's been some really salient points made today about the importance of a fair redistricting process, about the importance of this bill, H.R. 1 in particular, and H.R. 4 being taken across the finish line. Is this something where you can expand your campaign? When we talk about freedom to vote, that freedom isn't really freedom at all, right? If the very thing that we're telling people to go and do, they no longer can, their hands are tied. There are so many restrictions in place that it makes it impossible. So could the campaign be expanded to include the passage of these bills so that people actually can exercise their franchise?
First, I want to add to Stacey Abrams and AG Holder's comment. If you missed the phone number to be able to access your representative, you can go to vote.org/the-CW. They will connect you to your representative on a local or federal level so that you can reach out and make your comments known and go from there. In terms of the process, the people on the panel here are much better at this than a media company in terms of this. We can only give a voice to those who want to shout out, and that's why we're utilizing our platforms to do that. The impossibleness of interfering with the due process of everything is not what we do. But the ability to give a storytelling and the ability to ideate with Stacey or A.G. Holden or Jalen Rose or the Congressional Black Congress, we are there for to help work that out. But at the moment, what we're attempting to do is make people aware and let them reach out and talk to their representatives, as Stacey had said, if not once, twice, 3 times, to make sure that their voices are heard. Because the singular voice does make a difference. Voting is an imperative. I mean, in California right now, we're in the middle of a recall election, and every ballot was mailed, and you can go any way to do it. And that is how voting should be. You know, we should be able to reach out and vote. So you have the power of the ballot box to put in the candidates that you want in office. I don't know if I answered your question the way you wanted, Angela.
You know you did, Mark, but I'm gonna let you slide. You know, it's so funny. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, people always talk about, I hate politics. And I'm like, the business leaders are just as political in their answers, honey. But we will move right along to Jalen. I want to come to you because, you know, the organization is called More Than a Vote. And I think so often, again, we keep people in this box that is confined specific to the vote. There's the fight around the vote. There's the political power they have the ability to exercise after they cast the ballot and before they've casted the ballot. What are some of the other things, some of the other tools that you think is really important for folks who would say, I'm gonna listen because Jalen is talking about this? What's something else that folks need to be aware of, Jalen, in this fight for voting rights?
Here you go, a perfect example. And I'm gonna use how sports had a huge effect. And I'm a Michigan native, but also have family in Georgia. And I have to say, Stacey Abrams, you're a queen, you're a goddess, you're an angel. I just have to say that. And the WNBA were the first people I saw with Vote Warnock shirts on. I didn't know who that was. I remember being in Georgia, seeing people wearing those shirts because the WNBA players were doing it. How about the Milwaukee Bucks? They just won the championship this year. They were the first team that decided in the bubble that they weren't going to play after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And you know what they did during that couple of hours? They started calling and calling again, like you guys have just been advised today. And those voices became sirens because this is a 2-time MVP in Giannis Antetokounmpo, and there are a lot of sponsors expecting this game to start at 7 p.m. and they're not out there. That's how the power of sports and/or your voice can now make other people want to muzzle you because they recognize that you have that power. And so when you exercise it and you see it play out the way those 2 circumstances did, I don't have to tell any of you, it flipped the election. It literally flipped the election. And so it's really important, one by one. And I have to just say this. I'm still arguing with some people, to be honest with you, about getting vaccinated. I remember arguing with people about wearing seatbelts. You remember that time? Oh, it's uncomfortable. People riding in the car, stick your arm out. You didn't want to wear a seatbelt. I remember 13 and under. The first time, 15 and under, I believe. Whatever, I'm getting old. The first time I got on the airplane, the people on the airplane were smoking cigarettes. And I was like, I can't believe you can smoke cigarettes on the airplane, right? That's the same thing I bring up with vaccinations and voting. There was a time in this country that we didn't necessarily trust the system because there was nobody running that looked like us. And I don't have to tell AG Holder this. I was there when that changed. I was at the inauguration when Barack Obama got elected. That day it changed for us. And so don't take your voice, don't take your vote for granted. Make sure locally, nationally, we continue to up the ante, because this year, more people voted than ever. And so we have to continue that momentum.
I want to make sure, for the purposes of the foundation and the lawyers who will be watching this, he was strictly talking about the historic nature of those elections and not from a partisan perspective. So when he talked about Raphael Warnock and he talked about Barack Obama, it is because they are Black and not because they are Democrat. Moving right along. Moving right.
That part.
I want to come to another part, Jalen, because you rightfully gave Stacey the credit that is due. But Stacey, I do want to come to you because there were a number of organizations on the ground in Georgia that have helped to create the type of change that we so desperately needed to see. Of course, on the last panel, we had Cliff Albright from Black Voters Matter. You've worked with a number of other organizations. Can you talk about the importance of working together in coalition with those groups to see some of the changes we know not only needed to be made, but we still need to ensure they're made? This past weekend in Washington, there were several voting rights rallies and marches, and they're not in conflict. All of those things need to happen because different people can reach different audiences. Talk about why some of that is so important to you in your work.
I always make certain I lift up the other voices. I get credit because I was probably the loudest in the last 5 years about what was happening and about the consequences. But when I first joined the legislature, even during my time in college, this work has been happening. We just had the protection of the Voting Rights Act that made voter protection less important than voter engagement. But after 2013, voter protection became the most important piece, because rather than the safety that was provided through the Voting Rights Act and was ably defended, unfortunately, not to the success that we needed in 2013, when that switch turned, we suddenly had to start, instead of trying to convince people to vote, we had to protect those who wanted to vote from being pushed out of the system. And the groups that have been doing this work, the NAACP, Helen Butler and the Joseph Lowery Poor People's Campaign, you've had organizations that have grown and taken on more responsibility. GALEO, the Georgia Association of Latino Elected Officials, Latino Votes, the New Georgia Project, which I founded, but which is now an independent organization doing extraordinary work led by Nsé Ufot, Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And you've had this phalanx of smaller Black organizations, and it's been primarily African-American run organizations across the state and across the South. Because as Congresswoman Sewell can tell you, you've got groups in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Louisiana, in Florida, and Texas that have been fighting these battles for the last 10 years without having the resources or the attention. And so while I am grateful for compliments like those from Jalen Rose, the extraordinary athlete, I'm also recognizing that my value add was that I'm really good at begging people for their money and really good at yelling at the top of my lungs about what they're doing wrong. And I'm pretty good at setting up organizations to amplify those messages. But those messages have been on the ground. The work has been being done. And the reality is, once these bills pass, because I have faith in our Congress, I have faith in Terri Sewell and the CBC that we will get this work done, you've got to then enforce it. You then have to make it work. And you've got AG Holder out there. We've got, Merrick Garland, our current Attorney General. But if we don't know what's going wrong, we can't make it right. And so those same organizations are going to continue to need to be supported. This is not just about elections. Elections are moments. This is about the mission and the movement, which means that we've got to keep paying attention, keep supporting those organizations, those 2-person, 5-person organizations, as well as those 50 and 100-person organizations. But the communion of these groups together, to your point, Angela, it's a unified approach because we are all defending our democracy. We come at it in different ways, but we are in it together. And the last thing I'll say is that we also have to remember the disabled community. Because when we talk about the marginalized and the disadvantaged, the one community that cuts across every race, every age, every income bracket is the disabled community. And they are being harmed egregiously across this country by these laws. Because every time you think of a bill or a law that passes, it makes it difficult for someone to register and stay on the rolls, to cast a ballot and have that ballot counted. Imagine if you were already being pushed out of the system by your challenges, the remarkable meanness that these bills have and that they're lifting up against the disabled is something we should all be shouting about, because that affects every community. And that's another community that we need to always embrace and bring into this conversation.
Thank you, Stacey. AG Holder, I want to end with you, and it really is about how far we've come in a not so positive way since your tenure as AG. I was thinking about how we had to plan a walkout because of hyper partisanship and then the Republicans wanting to hold you in contempt of Congress for some nonsense. And I'm not making this partisan. I'm just making the point that when you consider folks' inability and lack of desire, right, to participate in something like the census, which then shapes the redistricting process, which then dictates whether or not we are going to have fair and balanced congressional districts and state legislative representation. But when we decide to sit on the sidelines, what does that do for what we need to happen going forward? And talk about how something like that really does disadvantage people who are choosing to silence themselves by sitting on the sidelines in every election and sitting on the sidelines when it comes time to fill out your census. Talk about how that impacts history makers like you.
No, I think that's a really good point. We should not underestimate the power that we have, the capacity that we have to bring about substantial change. You know, Stacey's really underplaying, the contribution that she has made, but she's one person who galvanized other people and really started a movement that obviously has had an impact in Georgia, but also around the nation. Jalen, a very committed, a great basketball player, a great person who is using his platform to be engaged in this fight. They say shut up and dribble because they're afraid of him. They're afraid of Jalen, and they're afraid of LeBron. They're afraid of athletes getting involved in this effort because they know the power that they have. What Mark brings to the fore, engaging the private sector, again, that puts fear into people who want to game the system. Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. But here's the deal. It doesn't bend on its own. It only bends when people like the folks you see on the screen and people who are listening and watching today put their hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. That's the reality. It involves leaders, certainly, but it also involves, or it necessarily involves people at every level, citizens deciding that they're going to bring about the necessary change. They're going to put their hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And I think we should be optimistic at the end of the day. This is not going to be something where it's going to be a smooth ride and everything's always going to go our way. There are going to be setbacks, and some things are going to seem like we can't possibly win. I'm sure that there were times when Dr. King thought, how am I going to bring down a system of American apartheid? I'm sure he was discouraged at times, and yet he kept on. He was successful in his what he ultimately tried to accomplish. And that's the kind of attitude I think that we have to have. But we have to understand it's going to involve all of us, whether you are a great basketball player, a person who is an elected official, you're in the private sector, in the faith community. If you're just a so-called ordinary citizen, you have the power, you have the capacity, you have the responsibility to bring about the change that we need and to protect our democracy.
I love this. I thank you all so much. I do want to note, we've talked a lot about Jalen's basketball skills. He is retired. I might be able to take him in a one-on-one game now, but he is an incredible host. He has a podcast. commentator extraordinaire. Let's give this man his flowers. He wasn't just talking mess on the basketball court. That was a gift that would be used a little later. So Jalen Rose, Eric Holder, Stacey Abrams, and Mark Pedowitz, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. Congresswoman, you know that we clearly have to keep this thing going. We want to get all our folks encouraged and excited about continuing the fight. So thank you all so much for what you do.
Thank you to all of our guests and panelists for participating in this critical conversation. Before we go, I want to share the words of Miss Amelia Boynton Robinson, one of the foot soldiers who marched on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday. At 103, she was my very special guest at the State of the Union where Barack Obama delivered his remarks in 2015. Before the president spoke, his cabinet to a person came up to Miss Amelia and said, "Oh, Miss Amelia, we stand on your shoulders. Oh, Miss Amelia, we stand on your shoulders." Now, out of the mouth of babes and our elders, she said, "Get off my shoulders and do your own work." And she was right. It's not enough to simply stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. We must also do our own work. There are many challenges that lie ahead, but today we're doing our own work and there's every reason to be hopeful. Our foremothers and forefathers fought, bled, and died for the right to vote. They weren't deterred, and we can't lose hope now either. They didn't give up, and neither shall we. We are forging onward and upward to passing H.R. 4 in the Senate and having it signed into law by President Joe Biden. Thank you, and let's stay in the fight.